the genes are not to blame. Convidamos we invited Sandra Maximiano, associate professor at ISEG. Sandra is a researcher, investigator, professor, etc., that really is focused on small data, not big data. So it's kind of a countersense here, okay? You are in the field of behavioral economics?
Yes, behavioral and experimental economics, kind of a new field within the field of economics and social science in general.
Okay. But after all, it's all about data and working with data on top of data. Yeah. You don't need the big data for your experiments, for your research, etc. And you developed, or you have been developing a study, an investigation, a research project on the topic of inequality. And we came across some of the latest information or touch point, whatever, of your investigation. And it's not even a funny story, but this is the 4th edition of our annual conference. We've had, throughout these 4 editions, I would say 120 easy different speakers, which we have invited for the 4 conferences. I do not have the figures, I do not have the data, is that correct now, but I would say less than 20% eventually are ladies, women.
Yep.
And not only not surprising, but we didn't invite a lot. Not a lot were willing and able to just say yes and grab the stage and go on stage, etc. There are plenty of explanations for that, but you have some that I believe that are definitely very valuable to share with the audience. So thank you very much to be with us and to bring your research to our stage.
Okay, thanks a lot for the invitation. And I will, actually, before moving on the presentation, I will touch again into this point of why don't we have more people, more females, presenting or willing to present or doing like a public speech or, accepting an invitation to talk at a conference or at, at television or just giving a simple interview. So as compared to males, it takes so much more effort from the organizers to actually get females willing to take the stage. And there are many different explanations for that, and we will discuss a bit on that topic today. And what I usually say, and I say that for myself, I very rarely refuse to give a talk because I insist that more females should actually say yes and maybe put behind their backs all the reasons that they have for not accepting the invitations. But sometimes it gets really too much for the few females that you probably see quite a lot, or always the same faces, frequently on TV or writing for newspapers or presenting at conference. But it's more because we cannot say no, given that we are trying to have everyone else to say yes. But it's a difficult job till so far. And so let's move on into these reasons for why we have this inequality. And everyone kind of know, and I'll actually jump into this slide, that we have a gender gap in earnings, a gender gap in leadership positions, a gender gap in, seeing females in more science, technology, engineer, and math type of courses, a gender gap in politics, a gender gap in speaking in public, and this list can actually continue with more detail. And what we want to know, and so here you have a bit of just a confirmation of that gender gap. I'm sorry, I'm still getting accustomed with this. So we have been improving along the years. In 2020, and the source is on Fortune magazine, we have here a picture of female CEOs in the Fortune 500. So basically, 37%, which is a big increase as compared to 98, only 2% of female CEOs, but still there is a big gap. And if you are not only looking at CEOs, but we look at all kind of leadership positions, we see this this big gap in, when we compare females and males at top positions. So why do we have this gender gap so common in many different contexts? So answering why, it's very important to know why, so we can actually act and decide what type of public policies and even other more private measures that we can take to change this situation. So one thing that we can ask is whether these differences in men and women pay and employment opportunities can be explained by discrimination or by differences in their preference or productivity. So basically, what this slide says is that we have different types of explanations. One type of explanation is on the offer side, and the other type of explanations are on the demand side. And basically, what social scientists have been doing is to try to figure out what explanations or what kind of explanations are most important to explain the gender differences. So on the offer side, we have, for example, differences in preference between career and family, differences in risk aversion attitudes, differences in willingness to compete, differences in negotiation or the willingness to compete, differences in preference for on-job training. When we talk about offer side, especially for those that haven't studied economics, who offers the job, so is basically workers. So when we are talking about offer side, is about the workers or about like the females and males at the job positions that are causing these differences to occur. So basically, on this side, it's like on the offer side, will be like the worker's fault, and on the demand side will be, let's say, the firms or the organizations, the employer's fault. So on the offer side, we may have this sort of justifications. Yeah, maybe females, they are not so willing to negotiate. They dislike to negotiate. They dislike to talk in public. Yeah? So if they dislike to talk in public, so it's very likely that they also dislike to negotiate. They are more risk averse. They basically dislike to compete. And all these differences have been actually studied and been proven right. And I'm going to tell you how actually we can study those differences. And on the demand side, then we have this very, quite well-known typical explanation, which is basically taste-based discrimination. Okay, employers just discriminate across genders. Our belief-based discrimination, it's not really a pure discrimination, but maybe they are based on correct or wrong beliefs about female relative productivity. Can be wrong, can be totally right. Imagine there are certain very particular jobs that we may need, I'll say, lots of strength, or thinking about construction, it might still be right that for certain particular jobs, you may expect males to be more productive, and you are right about that. But in majority, it's not, so it's basically beliefs that are wrong. So we can actually study these sort of reasons. And the next question is, how can we study them? One possibility, and basically you have been discussing a lot at this conference, is using what we call natural occurring data. Data that we collect from the real world, and nowadays, really big data. The problem with this big data, or this data that we collect, that comes from observing how people behave, It's often data that measure correlations. This data gives us correlations, doesn't give us a causal effect. Okay? And the reason for that is because there are many confounding effects or many things happening at the same time. So it's very difficult to somehow disentangle among all possible explanations that may cause this gender gap. So what we use, and in particular what I work quite a lot, is about generating the data, but generating the data through experiments. Right, so basically, what we try to do is to construct very simple experiments that can isolate the effects we want to measure. So if I want to study the explanation about willingness to negotiate, I try to keep all the other aspects constant. If I want to study like the willingness to compete, I will keep all the other aspects constant. So basically, I'm just isolating and see the importance of these effects. So can gender differences in wage negotiations, for example, explain part of the wage gap? And this is just a brief explanation how an experiment works. And here, before I move to like the genes and the field, let me talk about just a simplified version or an example of what an experiment is. So here is, we create this experiment also to measure this negotiation willingness. So we have an employer and a worker. So imagine this simple game. So the employer is offered a contract by a customer that is worth of 500 tokens and needs to hire a worker. Right? So this is a very simple situation. The employer's earnings are going to be equal to the 500 minus the wage is going to pay to the worker, and the worker's earnings are equal to the wage. Okay? So, and here now we have a game, so different rounds, and these two agents are going to engage in a negotiation. Okay? So if the worker is good at negotiating, he may gain a higher wage, and the firm will pay, the employer will pay a higher wage, so we will have a less profit. Okay, so this is a very simple situation. There is a random, let's say, device that determines at each round whether they will continue to negotiate or not. Okay, so kind of an exogenous, let's say, end of the experiment solution. So if the negotiation is not successful, there might be a possibility that both end up with 0. So basically, in this case, just not to end up with really, really 0, the workers will end up with 0, the employer's earnings are basically just 100, just to make this sort of inequality up front. But it's an unsuccessful wage negotiation. So I'll pass that, I'll let it explain. So now we have our subject pool that is participating in this experiment, some females, some males, and what we do is basically we randomly decide who is going to be an employer, who is going to be a worker. Okay, so these two groups, randomly chosen, so on average they are equal, and then what we do is assign these roles. Okay, so we have a group of employers, a group of workers, and we have different treatments that we are analyzing. So we are interested in this particular experiment whether, what type of negotiation is going to happen if we have mixed gender and the same gender groups. So we are going to have 4 treatments. We have females with females, males with males, so as worker and employer, and the mixed genders. And some main results, and this was done in a lab. Male employees obtain on average higher wages than females. Male employees obtain on average higher wages bargaining with female employers. And male employers are on average able to pay lower wages to female employees. Okay, so this confirming this wage gap or this in a negotiation setting. Right. This is another example, and this one is particularly important before I move on. So it's another experiment where we want to measure the willingness to compete. It's very simple. We also have groups of people that, they are males and females, and they have to perform a very simple task. The task is basically summing, summing series of 4 two-digit numbers. Very simple. Of course, there are no significant differences in productivity between males and females in this simple task. Okay? And again, this is the beauty of experiments. In real world, we don't know. For certain tasks, there might be some gender differences, but in the lab, in an experiment, you can actually control for that. So in this experiment, you don't have any gender differences in performance. But what we did was basically see how they wanted to be paid. So we had 2 schemes of payment. So basically, piece rate. So you are paid according to your own performance, or you engage in a competitive environment. You are matched with another subject, and the one that gets the highest number of sums correct, they get a higher payment as compared to a piece rate, and the other one gets 0. So we have a competitive scheme versus just an absolute payment scheme. What's happening in this sort of experiment? And this is we replicated this many times, and these are basically the results. So we have men selecting into the tournament much more often than females. Okay? So females select into the tournament 35%, and then males 73%. And also, if you look about their confidence, males are much more overconfident. So male expecting to be first, 75% expect to be first, while females 43%. Okay, but again, what is the reason for that? Are just females different? Is like a different in preference? So what we wanted now to do next was to give an answer to that question. So we went to the real world, and we used the real world as a lab and to conduct field experiments, what we call field experiments. And in particular, we're interested not only just to go to a firm and mimic this experiment, and we did that, by the way. We did that, and we still observe this. We still observe the same sort of behavior when we move to the real world, let's say performing these experiments in a firm setting, as compared to the lab. But we did one step further, was basically, now coming to the genes cannot be blamed, we went to find a society, trying to find a society that has a sort of organization that is not patriarchal. Okay? So it's a matrilineal society, and basically the one in particular that we went to was Shillong in Meghalaya, a state in northeastern India, so they can see in red, so really far away. And we had researchers from, from US, from Turkey, from Denmark, so we were a big team, actually, from all over the world, and me from Portugal. By the time I started this, I was in US, and we still keep doing this sort of research. It's big, so what we did was trying to go there and replicate all sorts of experiments I was telling you about, but now in this society. And I know I don't have so much time, but now I just wanted to show some pictures. This is basically Shillong's market. We did a negotiation experiment here. Okay? So in this market, you have sellers from this Kasi society and from another society as well. I'm going to explain that. And we replicate, but now in the field, this sort of negotiation. I'll go back to that. But the Kasi society, just very briefly, It's a matrilineal society where family lineage is traced to the mother, with family assets, name, and wealth passing to the youngest daughter, and not to father to son. A family, this is just curiosity, must adopt a girl if it has no doctor to provide for an heir. Females are the heads of the family and take on leadership roles, even in the public sphere, and in many cases also support their families financially. You can see they work, they are most the ones like working and are selling in a market, and these are just picking tea leaves, so this is the region of Assam, also big tea producers. So they work outside the home. And here is a nice picture that I took it during our experiments. So this is a male from the Kasi family, and they take care of the kids. Okay? So men are increasingly complaining that the tradition has left them neglected and devoid of motivation. So it's really an upside down. It was also very interesting that when I took the data, and at the time I was in US, and my secretary that was helping, organizing the data in the Excel, and one day she knocked at my office door and she said, there is a mistake in this data. There is a mistake. Someone collected this data and made a mistake because females are always classified as the head of household. And this is for you to see how prejudices are so much into us. Yeah? So for her, that was a mistake. So, but we do experiments. So because we do experiments, we need a society to compare with. And so what we call a control group. So we need a group that is basically the same as our target group, our treatment group, but that shares the main characteristics, but as one or two variables at maximum that are different. Yeah? So in this case, we wanted a patriarchal society, but that genetically is very similar. And that was one of the reasons why we went to this region in India, because they have a Karbi society that lives very close nearby, so that market, you find both societies interacting. And these are the females from Karbi society. And this was also, they were waiting for, to participate in our experiment, and, they are the ones taking care of the kids. We only get food from Karbi society. They were very nice, like this mimicking of the Western world, offering us food and, being super nice. Totally different from females from the Kasi society. So in the Karbi society, women do not typically own land, and the oldest son inherits the family's property after the death of the parents. But they share the same agrarian lifestyle and diet, so Kasi and Karbi. They reside in close proximity, as I said, and DNA tests, and we also had doctors in our team, so indicate that they are closely related. So we even conducted some tests, and also not only just DNA, but we also have some biological measures and hormone tests and testosterone levels, and so on. So they are very similar in those sort of indicators. So this is me on one of these experiments with people from Kasi. And this is basically one picture from an experiment trying to measure the willingness to compete. The same that in the lab we are asking them to, compute those sums. Of course, we go to the field, we cannot expect to just mimic exactly the experiment, so we have to adapt the experiment. And here we have them, performing a very simple task, no differences between females and males again, just throwing balls to a basket. And the idea was to understand how they wanted to be paid. So the results from many experiments, because we conducted so many different types of experiments to measure risk, to measure willingness to compete, to measure negotiation, to measure, social preference. How do people trust others? How do people reciprocate? So we have many kind of experiments, and these are just a very general summary of the results. So women are less competitive than men in patriarchal society, but this result reverses in matrilineal society, where women are more competitive than men. Okay? Cassie female behave like Carby male. Carby male behave very closely to the Western males that we have data from the lab. Similarly, talking about negotiation type of experiments, women are worse negotiators than men in patriarchal society. What I mean worse, they mean they end up with a lower payoff. They don't bargaining for too long. They are more, they just don't want to engage in the negotiation. And we did that in the market. But this result reverses in matrilineal society, where women are better negotiators than men. Pro-social behavior. Women are more pro-social than men. What I mean more pro-social, they trust more, they reciprocate more, they donate more money, like to charities. This is a measure of pro-social behavior. They are more pro-social than males in patriarchal societies and also in the Western world. But this result reverses in matrilineal society, where women are less pro-social than men. And at last, I have another one about risk-averse. Risk-averse is one measure, one possible justification for gender gap. Females are prone to take less risks than males, and this is a very common result. I even have that data for Portuguese population, a representative sample of the entire population for continental Portugal, a big study that I did not long ago to Gulbenkian. And we have that the same in Portugal. Females are much more risk-averse than males. And the same happened in patriarchal societies, but no difference across gender in matrilineal society. Here, we didn't find a statistical significant difference between males and females in the matrilineal society, but very significant at patriarchal society. Risk attitudes are very important when we are talking about leadership positions. So when we move from lower level jobs to top higher jobs, you need to be able to take risks, also to speak in public, also to engage in a negotiation. So the risk attitudes are a very important variable for that. So no differences between societies until poverty, and here I also am going to very shortly tell you that we are now recently have been doing, still keep conducting these experiments. So we are testing other tasks, more complex tasks, like solving more complex puzzles and giving big incentives to subjects in these societies to do that. And what we see is basically in Carby society, men outperformed women in this task. So now we are moving to tasks where we clearly need education, and then we see in patriarchal societies there, we have males performing better at these tasks, but in caste societies we don't. And we don't because actually the education level of females is pretty good. So, thanks a lot. I know that I'm a bit over time, and this is the picture from our lab at ISEG, so if you are all invited to come and visit us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have another conclusion to share, that when we finally are able to bring women on stage, they do use the time they have assigned, plus 50%, much longer. So it's a question of just getting women on stage and then just leave it on them. Next year, we'll have you again. Thank you very much. The wonders, I'm kidding, of course. The wonders of small data. We talk way too much about big data, and the work you do is just so amazing. Thank you so much for sharing it. And we'll be sharing this presentation, and I think we within DSPA have so much small data sets that can be, labbed by you, can be worked by you. We'll talk later for sure.
It will be great. And also I'll take 1 minute to tell people that if you, even in your firms, even in your organizations, don't be afraid of experiments, okay? Experiment. Do experiments, conduct, you have real data.
Right.
One thing is just like collecting data. Another thing is controlling the collection of data. Okay, so you have in your hands the possibility to do a control group, treatment group, and design the experiments. If you want to learn more about experiments and design of experiments, talk to us. We have a good group in ISEG, but that's one step further from just generating in a more controlled way data.
It's exciting, amazing. Thank you very much, Sandra. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.